There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that wear the camouflage of a Tuesday afternoon or a simple change in the weather. You don't recognize their weight until much later, when you trace the map of your own heart and find the precise coordinate where everything shifted. For me, that coordinate was marked by the gentle hiss of falling snow against old window panes and the low, resonant hum of Julian's voice as he read aloud from a worn paperback, completely unaware that he was building a new world around us with every word. The storm wasn't just happening outside. It was a quiet, inexorable force gathering within the four walls of my small cabin, a pressure system of unspoken things that had been building between us for the better part of a decade. And as the first night of our unintentional seclusion deepened, as the world outside vanished into a uniform, silent white, I had the terrifying and exhilarating premonition that by the time the snow melted, nothing would ever be the same. The silence between his sentences was no longer empty. It was filled with the deafening sound of a choice I had to make. I had known Julian since we were 18, a fact that felt both impossible and foundational. We were assigned as roommates in a cinder-block dormitory that smelled perpetually of stale pizza and institutional floor wax. I was quiet, armed with a sketchbook and a camera, cataloging the world from a safe distance. He was a supernova of easy confidence and restless energy, a software engineering prodigy who seemed to collect friends as effortlessly as he collected accolades. He was all bright, kinetic motion, while I was stillness and shadow. It was a friendship that should not have worked by any conventional logic. Yet it did. He saw something in my quiet that he didn't mistake for disinterest, and I saw something in his constant motion that I recognized not as arrogance, but as a kind of searching. He never pushed me to be louder, and I never asked him to be still. We simply carved out a space in the middle, a pocket of mutual understanding that became the most stable geography in my life. My feelings for him didn't arrive in a single, crashing wave. They were more like a tide, creeping slowly up the shore of our friendship over years, so gradually that I barely noticed until the day I found myself completely submerged. It was a Tuesday, junior year. He'd come back from a brutal calculus exam, thrown his backpack on the floor, and collapsed onto his bed with a groan that seemed to carry the weight of the entire semester. He hadn't said a word, just stared at the popcorn ceiling, one arm thrown over his eyes. I was at my desk, editing photos, pretending not to watch him. And in that quiet, unguarded moment, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, I felt a pang in my own so sharp and specific it was like a key turning in a lock I never knew existed. It wasn't just affection, not just the deep, comfortable love of a friend. It was something more fragile and far more dangerous. It was the quiet, devastating realization that his happiness had somehow become inextricably tangled with my own. From that day forward, I became an expert in the art of loving from a distance. I was a cartographer of his moods, a historian of his fleeting relationships, a silent archivist of his smiles. I learned the precise cadence of his breathing when he was asleep, the way a small muscle in his jaw would tick when he was concentrating, the exact shade of gold his eyes turned in the late afternoon sun. My camera, which had always been my shield, became my accomplice. I have hundreds of photos of him, most of which he's never seen. Julian laughing with friends on the campus quad. Julian hunched over a laptop, bathed in the blue glow of the screen, a line of concentration etched between his brows. Julian asleep on our lumpy dorm room couch, his features softened, his usual kinetic energy finally at rest. I told myself it was practice, an exercise in capturing light and shadow. But I knew, in the honest dark of my developing room, that I was trying to capture the uncapturable. I was trying to hold on to pieces of him, because I was terrified that was all I would ever have. After college, our lives diverged in a way that seemed both natural and cruel. He took a high-powered consulting job that sent him ricocheting between cities, living out of a suitcase, his life a blur of airports and hotel rooms. I did the opposite. I retreated. I bought a small, isolated cabin in the mountains with the inheritance my grandmother had left me, a place surrounded by silent, stoic pines and the vast, indifferent sky. It was where I could work, where I could breathe, where the quiet didn't feel like emptiness. We maintained our friendship through late-night phone calls and sporadic visits. He would appear at my door, exhausted and hollowed out by his travels, and my cabin would become his sanctuary for a weekend. He would sleep for 12 hours straight, and I would make him coffee and soup, and we would talk about everything and nothing. During these visits, the carefully constructed walls around my heart would feel impossibly thin. I would watch him move through my space, his presence filling the quiet rooms, and the ache of my unspoken affection would be a physical thing, a constant, low-grade fever I had learned to live with. He was the sun, and for a few days, my small, quiet world would orbit him. Then he would leave, and the silence he left behind was always heavier than the silence that had been there before. This time, he had arrived with less than a day's notice, his voice a frayed edge over the phone. A massive project in Denver had finally ended after 3 months of grueling 16-hour days. He didn't say he was burned out, but I could hear it in the spaces between his words. He sounded like a string pulled too taut, about to snap. "Can I come crash for a few days, Leo?" he'd asked, the question less a request and more a plea. "I just need to not see an airport for a minute, of course." I said yes. I always said yes. He arrived looking like a ghost, his usual vibrant energy dimmed to a pilot light. There were new lines of fatigue etched around his eyes, and he moved with a weariness that seemed to have settled deep into his bones. He gave me a tired, grateful smile, dropped his bag by the door, and immediately collapsed onto my sofa, asleep before I could even offer him a drink. I stood there for a long time, just watching him, a familiar and painful tenderness swelling in my chest. He was searching for stillness, and he had come to me, the quietest person he knew, to find it. The first flakes began to fall that evening, fat and lazy, drifting down through the pines like scattered feathers. The forecast had called for a light dusting, nothing more. We watched it from the big picture window in the living room, mugs of tea warming our hands. Julian seemed to be slowly recharging, the deep quiet of the woods seeping into him. He was more present than he'd been in months, his phone left forgotten on the kitchen counter. He talked about the project, the frustrating clients, the sterile loneliness of corporate apartments. I listened, providing the quiet space he needed to unpack his exhaustion. The snow was beautiful, a soft blanket settling over the dark landscape. There was a sense of peace to it, a feeling of the world being muffled and slowed down. Neither of us realized it was a siege in disguise. It was only the next morning when we woke to a world transformed, a world erased. The snow was no longer falling. It was a solid, silent wall of white, burying my car, burying the road, burying any thought of him leaving. "Well," Julian said, standing at the window with a look of stunned disbelief. "I guess I'm not going anywhere." He didn't sound panicked or annoyed. He sounded relieved. A small, almost imperceptible smile played at the corners of his mouth as he looked out at the impossible depth of the snow. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Trapped. The word echoed in my mind, layered with 1,000 conflicting emotions. I was trapped here with the one person who could unravel me with a single glance. It was a terrifying thought. It was a secret, desperate wish come true. I had his undivided attention, his uninterrupted presence, not for a few fleeting hours, but for days. The cabin, which had always been my fortress of solitude, suddenly felt incredibly small, charged with a new and volatile energy. The silence was no longer just my own. It was ours, a shared territory we now had to navigate together. The first day passed in a comfortable, domestic rhythm that felt both strange and deeply familiar. We made a big breakfast, rationed the firewood, and played a marathon of cribbage games. The power flickered once, twice, then died with a quiet sigh, plunging us into the dim, blue-gray light of a snow-heavy afternoon. We lit candles and the oil lamps I kept for emergencies, and the cabin was transformed. The shadows grew long and soft, and the world shrank to the small, warm circle of light around us. In this new, intimate twilight, Julian's presence seemed to expand. He was no longer just a guest on my sofa. He was a partner in this small survival, his movements sure and capable as he helped me find more candles, his laughter echoing in the sudden, profound silence of a house without electricity. I photographed him in the flickering light, the lens of my old manual camera loving the way the shadows carved his face, the way the flame danced in his eyes. He didn't pose, he just existed, and I captured it, feeling like a thief stealing moments of impossible beauty. As evening bled into night, the temperature inside the cabin began to drop. My small wood stove was the only source of heat, and its warmth was a precious, localized thing. We huddled closer to it, wrapped in blankets. We sat on the large sheepskin rug in front of the hearth, our shoulders almost touching, watching the flames devour the logs. The easy chatter of the afternoon faded away, replaced by a comfortable quiet. It was Julian who broke it. He shifted, turning to look at me, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "It's really quiet up here," he said, his voice low. It wasn't an observation. It felt like a confession. "I don't think I've experienced this much quiet in years." I knew what he meant. His life was a symphony of noise, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the roar of jet engines. Silence was a foreign country for him. "Is it a good quiet or a bad quiet?" I asked, my own voice softer than I intended. He considered this for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. "It's good," he said finally. "It's just loud. The quiet, I mean. You can hear yourself think." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Maybe that's what I've been running from." The admission hung in the air between us, raw and vulnerable. This was a version of Julian I rarely saw, the curtain of his easy charm pulled back to reveal the deep-seated restlessness beneath. He wasn't running toward success or ambition. He was running away from the silence, away from himself. And now, the snow had stopped him in his tracks, forcing him to face it here, with me. I didn't know what to say, so I just stayed quiet, offering him the one thing I was an expert in, a safe silence. I hoped he understood it for what it was, not an absence of words, but a presence, an offering of space. Later, when it was time to sleep, the cold had become a serious, biting thing. My bedroom, at the far end of the cabin, was frigid. The guest loft was even worse. The only truly warm place was the few feet of floor directly in front of the stove. We looked at the sofa, then at the rug, a silent negotiation passing between us. "My room's an icebox," I admitted. "We'll freeze if we try to sleep separately." It was a simple statement of fact, a logistical problem, but the words felt heavy with implication. It was Julian who made the decision, his approach so practical and straightforward that it almost disarmed the frantic alarm bells ringing in my head. "Well, we're not going to freeze," he said, his tone matter of fact. He grabbed the pile of quilts from the end of my bed and the pillows from the sofa. "We'll just have to camp out here. Build a nest." And so he built a nest. He arranged the pillows and quilts on the sheepskin rug, creating a makeshift bed in the warm, golden bubble of the firelight. It was an act of pure pragmatism, yet I watched him with a kind of breathless reverence. He was solving a problem, but what he was really doing was dismantling the last remaining boundary between us. The unspoken rule of our friendship, the careful preservation of personal space that had always kept my feelings safely contained, was about to be broken out of simple necessity. He finished his work and looked at me, a soft, almost shy smile on his face. There, not exactly a five-star hotel, but it's warm. My heart was a traitor, pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I could barely manage a nod. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. The first night was an exercise in exquisite torture. We lay down side by side, a careful foot of space between us, two separate islands in a sea of blankets. I lay ramrod straight, my muscles coiled with tension, every nerve ending hyper-aware of his proximity. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small gap. I could hear every breath he took, a slow, steady rhythm that I tried to match with my own ragged, shallow ones. I was terrified to move, terrified to breathe too loudly, terrified that the sheer force of my longing would somehow become a tangible thing he could feel in the air. I stared into the darkness, my eyes tracing the patterns the dying fire threw onto the ceiling, and I listened to the sound of the wind howling outside, a perfect mirror for the storm inside me. I wanted to close the distance between us so badly it was a physical ache, a hollow craving in the pit of my stomach. And I wanted to run, to bolt from the cabin and disappear into the snow, to escape the unbearable sweetness of this proximity. I must have eventually fallen into a light, restless sleep, because I was woken by a subtle shift in the space beside me. I opened my eyes to find that the distance between us was gone. In his sleep, Julian had rolled onto his side, toward me. One of his arms was thrown across my chest, his hand resting loosely on my shoulder. His face was buried in the space between my neck and the pillow, his warm breath ghosting against my skin. He was fast asleep, his features relaxed and peaceful. My entire body went rigid. I stopped breathing. It was an accident, a simple, unconscious movement in the middle of the night. It meant nothing. But my heart didn't care about logic. My heart only knew that Julian was holding me. It was the realization of 1,000 secret, impossible dreams, and it was happening by chance. I lay there for what felt like hours, a statue carved from fear and desire, listening to the steady beat of his heart against my ribs, feeling the weight of his arm like a brand. It was the closest I had ever been to him, and it was the loneliest I had ever felt. The second day dawned with no change. The snow was still a fortress wall, the silence still absolute. The power remained off. When we woke up, tangled together in the nest of blankets, there was a moment of thick, awkward silence. Julian pulled his arm away quickly, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "Sorry," he mumbled, not looking at me. "I'm a bit of a space invader when I sleep." I just shook my head, my throat too tight to form words. "It's fine," I managed to whisper. It was cold. We tried to pretend it hadn't happened. We made coffee on the wood stove, the morning routine a welcome distraction, a script we could both follow. But something had changed. The air was different, charged with a new awareness. The accidental intimacy of the night had left an invisible imprint on the space between us. We were more careful with each other, our movements more deliberate, our glances shorter, as if we were afraid of what we might see in each other's eyes. The day wore on, slow and quiet. We read. I sketched in my notebook, unable to focus. The image of him sleeping beside me burned into my mind. He tried to get a signal on his phone, holding it up to the window in a futile attempt to breach the wall of the storm and connect with the outside world, but it was useless. We were completely cut off, adrift in our own small, quiet bubble. The tension that had been a low hum was now a high, keening note that vibrated through every interaction. Every time our hands brushed as we reached for the same log, every time our eyes met across the small cabin, it was there. It was a conversation happening in a language neither of us dared to speak. I found myself watching his hands, the way he gestured when he talked, the way he ran them through his already messy hair in moments of frustration. I wondered what it would feel like to have those hands on me again, but this time with intention, with purpose. The thought was so powerful, so vivid, that I had to look away, my cheeks burning. That night, we rebuilt the nest in front of the fire without discussion. It was the only logical thing to do. But this time, the pretense of it being a purely practical arrangement was gone. We both knew what it meant. We were choosing to lie down together again. As we settled into the blankets, the space between us felt even more significant than it had the night before. It was a deliberate void, a testament to our shared uncertainty. For a long time, we lay in silence, facing away from each other, two solitary figures staring into the darkness. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the mournful cry of the wind. I felt a profound sadness settle over me. Here I was, lying next to the person I loved more than anything, and we were separated by an ocean of unspoken words. The fear of ruining our friendship had been my compass for so long, but now, it felt like a cage. Leo, his voice, when it came, was so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. It was a tentative sound in the vast quiet of the room. I turned my head on the pillow to face him. In the dim, flickering light, I could just make out his silhouette, The dark shape of him turned toward me. Yeah. My own voice was a dry whisper. He was quiet for another long moment, and I could feel the weight of his hesitation. He was on the edge of a precipice, just like me. I wasn't asleep, he said, his voice barely audible over the fire. Last night, when I moved over, I wasn't asleep, the world stopped. The fire, the wind, the frantic beating of my own heart, it all went silent. Every carefully constructed defense I had built over the last 10 years crumbled into dust. He hadn't been asleep. It hadn't been an accident. It had been a choice. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the dark shape of him, my mind a blank slate wiped clean by his confession. He had known. He had consciously closed the distance between us, held me, and let me believe it was a dream. The implications of that act were so enormous, so terrifying, that I couldn't begin to process them. He must have taken my silence for rejection, because he let out a shaky breath and the words came tumbling out in a rushed, quiet torrent. I'm sorry. It was out of line. I know. I don't know, Leo. Being here, with the storm, with everything so quiet. It's messing with my head. I'm so tired of everything. And you're the only person I feel like I can actually breathe around. And last night, it was warm. And it felt safe. I'm sorry. We can forget it. I shouldn't have said anything. He started to roll away from me, a movement of retreat, of closing himself off again. And in that moment, something inside me broke. It was the dam of a decade of silence, of careful observation, of patient, painful longing. I couldn't let him retreat. I couldn't let this moment of terrifying, beautiful honesty slip away and be buried under a fresh layer of pretense. My hand shot out, my fingers closing around his wrist. My touch was clumsy, uncertain, but it stopped him. Don't, I whispered, the word raw and aching in my throat. Don't be sorry. He went still, his back still to me, but I could feel the tension humming through him where my fingers touched his skin. He didn't pull away. He waited, and I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that the next words had to be mine. All these years, I had been the observer, the quiet one, the safe harbor. But a harbor is no good if you never invite the ship to dock. Julian, I said, my voice shaking but clear. Turn around. He turned slowly, cautiously, as if expecting a blow. He rolled onto his back and then onto his other side, until we were facing each other, two shadows in the firelight. The space between us now was only inches, but it felt like a universe. I could see the glint of the flames in his eyes, the uncertainty and fear warring there. He looked younger than I had ever seen him, stripped of all his usual confidence, his defenses gone. He just looked lost, and I realized that my own fear was nothing compared to the desolation I saw in his eyes. I let go of his wrist and lifted my hand, my fingers trembling, to his face. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my fingertips hovering in the air just beside his cheek. It was the final boundary, the last uncrossed line. This was no accident. This was a choice. I closed my eyes for a brief second, took a breath, and then I touched him. My fingers brushed against the rough stubble on his jaw, and a jolt went through both of us, a current of shared shock and recognition. He didn't flinch. He leaned into my touch, ever so slightly, a silent surrender. His eyes fluttered shut, and in that small, almost imperceptible movement, he gave me my answer. All the words I had rehearsed in my head for years, all the eloquent speeches and careful confessions, they all evaporated. They were useless. There was only this moment, this quiet, this truth. I leaned in, closing the final inches between us, and I pressed my lips to his. It wasn't a passionate kiss or a desperate one. It was as quiet and as tentative as his confession. It was a question, a statement, and a prayer all at once. It was 10 years of unspoken words, of stolen glances, of patient longing, all poured into one gentle, searching touch. For a moment, he was perfectly still, and a sliver of pure terror shot through me. I had misread everything. I had ruined it all. I started to pull back, my mind screaming at my own stupidity. But then, his hand came up and tangled in the hair at the back of my neck, holding me there. His other arm wrapped around my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us at all, just the rough wool of our sweaters and the frantic, syncopated rhythm of our hearts beating against each other. And he kissed me back. It was a kiss of profound, soul-deep relief. It was a homecoming. It was the sound of two quiet, lonely storms finally breaking. We weren't trapped by the snow anymore. We were sheltered by it. And in the warm, flickering light of the fire, surrounded by the silent, sleeping woods, we finally began to speak the truth. The morning after was a landscape of terrifying clarity. I woke first, just as the faintest gray light began to filter through the window, turning the snow outside from an impenetrable black to a soft, bruised purple. Julian was still asleep, his body curled against mine, his head tucked under my chin, one of his hands resting over my heart as if he were guarding it. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing, breathing embers. The cabin was silent, save for the sound of his slow, even breathing. Last night felt like a dream, a beautiful, impossible mirage conjured by firelight and isolation. But the solid, warm weight of him against me was real. The faint, clean scent of his skin was real. The memory of his lips on mine was real. And with that reality came a tidal wave of fear, so potent it stole the air from my lungs. What had we done? In the clear, cold light of day, the raw, emotional honesty of the night seemed reckless, a temporary madness brought on by the storm. I had crossed a line I had sworn to myself for a decade I would never cross. I had risked the most important friendship in my life on a single, desperate gamble. I watched him sleep, his face peaceful and unguarded, and a cold dread seeped into me. He had come here seeking refuge, a safe place to fall apart, and I had taken advantage of his vulnerability. He had confessed to being lost and confused, and my response had been to kiss him. The thought was a shard of ice in my gut. He would wake up, the spell of the night would be broken, and he would be filled with regret. He would look at me with pity, or worse, with fear, and the easy, comfortable foundation of our friendship would be a ruin. I carefully, painstakingly, extricated myself from his embrace, my movements as slow and deliberate as a bomb disposal expert's. He stirred, murmuring something in his sleep, but didn't wake. I crept away from the nest of blankets, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. I added a few logs to the stove, coaxing the embers back to life, the small, mundane task a welcome anchor in the churning sea of my anxiety. I needed to put some distance between us, to build my walls back up before he woke. I went into the kitchen and started the ritual of making coffee on the camp stove, my hands shaking so badly that I spilled half the grounds on the counter. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the cabin, sounded like his footsteps. I was a fugitive in my own home, waiting for the inevitable moment of reckoning. When he finally emerged from the living room, he was wrapped in one of the quilts, his hair a mess, his eyes still clouded with sleep. He didn't look at me. He walked to the window and stared out at the endless white, his shoulders slumped. The silence was a living thing, a thick, suffocating presence that filled every corner of the cabin. It wasn't the comfortable, companionable silence of the days before. It was a silence of regret, of things that could not be unsaid, of a chasm that had opened up between us while we slept. I poured him a mug of coffee and set it on the counter, then retreated to the other side of the room, pretending to organize my camera lenses. I couldn't bear to look at him, couldn't bear to see the confirmation of my fears in his eyes. Leo, his voice was rough with sleep, and it made me flinch. I took a deep breath before turning to face him. I tried to arrange my features into a mask of casual neutrality, a feat of acting that deserved some kind of award. "Morning," I said, my voice unnaturally bright. "Coffee's ready." He still didn't look at me. He just kept staring out the window, his knuckles white where he gripped the mug. "About last night," he began, and my heart plummeted. This was it. The apology. The "let's just forget this happened" speech. The gentle, soul-crushing demolition of everything. I think I was just really confused," he said, the words halting, uncertain. "The storm, being stuck here. It's a lot. I shouldn't have. I put you in a weird position. I'm sorry, Every word was a hammer blow. It was worse than I had imagined. He wasn't just regretting it. He was erasing it, attributing it to a temporary insanity, a side effect of the weather. He was invalidating the most honest moment of my entire life, packaging it up as a symptom of his own confusion. A bitter, angry heat flared in my chest, burning through the fear. It was one thing for me to be terrified, but it was another thing entirely for him to dismiss it, to reduce that kiss, that moment of searing, mutual vulnerability, to a mere byproduct of cabin fever. For 10 years, I had quietly and patiently loved him, respecting his life, his choices, his boundaries. I had never asked for anything. But last night, he had opened a door, and now he was trying to slam it shut in my face. And I just snapped. The quiet observer, the patient archivist, the master of self-containment, simply ceased to exist. In his place was someone I barely recognized, someone fueled by a decade of repressed hope and the sharp, ugly sting of humiliation. Confused, I said, my voice low and shaking with a fury that stunned me. Is that what we're calling it? You were confused. He finally turned to look at me, his eyes wide with surprise at my tone. He saw something in my face he had never seen before, and he took a half-step back. Leo, I just mean, no. I cut him off, taking a step toward him, closing the space he had tried to create. You don't get to do that. You don't get to use confused as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Not for this. Not with me. My voice was rising, echoing in the shocked silence of the cabin. Was it confusing when you chose to lie next to me? Was it confusing when you admitted you weren't asleep? Was it confusing when you kissed me back? Each question was an indictment, a refusal to let him hide. Because it wasn't confusing for me, Julian. It was the least confusing moment of my life. The color drained from his face. He looked trapped, cornered. That's not fair, he whispered, his voice cracking. You don't know, what don't I know? I challenged, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was tearing everything down, our whole history, but I couldn't stop. The truth was out, and it was a wild, uncontrollable thing. That you're lonely? That you're running from something? I know that. I've always known that. But what you did last night, that wasn't about you being lonely. That was about us. Don't you dare try to pretend it wasn't. Don't you dare disrespect me like that. I don't know what I am, he suddenly yelled, his voice breaking with a raw, desperate anguish that cut through my anger and struck me to the core. He slammed the coffee mug down on the windowsill, coffee sloshing over the sides. Okay, is that what you want to hear? I don't know who I am or what I want. My whole life has been this. This checklist. Good grades, good college, good job. A girlfriend. That's the plan. That's the path. And it's miserable. It's empty. And I come here, and the world stops, and there's just you. And it's quiet. And it feels right. It feels more real than anything else in my entire life. And it terrifies me, Leo. It terrifies me because it's not on the checklist. You are not on the checklist. His confession, so wrenching and honest, extinguished my anger like a splash of cold water. We stood there, breathing heavily in the aftermath of our emotional detonation, the air thick with the wreckage of our politeness. His words hung between us, a brutal and beautiful admission of his fear. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of what I represented, a deviation from the life he thought he was supposed to live. He was terrified of the relief and rightness he felt with me, because it meant everything else he'd been chasing was a lie. My own anger dissolved into a profound, aching empathy. I saw him then, not as the confident, kinetic force I had always known, but as a man just as lost and scared as I was. We were both just fumbling in the dark, trying to find our way. I walked over to him slowly and picked up his trembling hand from the windowsill. His skin was cold. I held it between both of mine, trying to warm it, to ground him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at our hands, his jaw tight. Hey, I said softly. Look at me. He shook his head. Julian, please. After a long, tense moment, he lifted his head, and his eyes, when they finally met mine, were swimming with unshed tears. The sight of his vulnerability undid me completely. There is no checklist, I said, my voice thick with emotion. There's no plan. There's just this moment. This room. You and me. That's all that's real right now. And you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to know who you are. You have to not run away. Not from this. Not from me. Can you do that? Can you just stay? It was the most important question I had ever asked. It wasn't about a relationship or a label or a future. It was about the here and now. It was about him choosing to face the terrifying, beautiful truth with me, instead of turning his back on it. A single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just looked at me, a long, searching look, as if he were seeing me for the first time. And then, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Okay, he whispered, the word a fragile promise in the quiet air. Okay, Leo. I'll stay. The storm broke that afternoon. Not the one outside. The snow continued to fall, thick and relentless, but the one inside the cabin. After his whispered promise, the tension didn't vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer the sharp, anxious wire of uncertainty, but the heavy, grounding weight of a shared truth. We didn't talk much for the rest of the day. There were no more grand confessions or confrontations. The emotional cataclysm had left us both exhausted, raw. We moved around each other with a new kind of gentleness, a quiet, careful choreography of two people learning a new dance. We existed in the space his honesty had cleared, a landscape that was both barren and full of possibility. We were starting from scratch, and the first step, it seemed, was silence. A new kind of silence. Not the silence of unspoken feelings, but the silence of mutual understanding. We sat by the fire, reading our respective books, but the act was a pretense. I wasn't absorbing the words on the page. I was acutely aware of him, of the way his brow furrowed in concentration, of the sound of him turning a page, of the steady rhythm of his breathing. He was here. He hadn't retreated into his phone or into a brittle, cheerful facade. He had stayed, just as he promised. He was present in his confusion and his fear, and in a strange way, it was the most intimate he had ever been with me. He was letting me see the messy, unfinished parts of him, and I felt a surge of protective tenderness so fierce it almost hurt. This was so much more real than the polished, confident version of himself he showed to the rest of the world. This was Julian, and I was in love with all of it. As evening approached, the unspoken question of where we would sleep hung in the air. I think we were both terrified of it. To sleep apart would feel like a retreat, a negation of everything that had passed between us. To sleep together felt like a commitment we weren't ready to name. As I started to stoke the fire for the night, Julian came and stood beside me, watching the flames. We don't have to, he started, his voice trailing off, unable to finish the sentence. I knew what he was trying to offer me, an escape route, a way back to the safety of how things were. But I didn't want it. I didn't want to go back. I want to, I said simply, not looking at him, my gaze fixed on the fire. I want to sleep here. With you. If that's what you want. I was leaving the door open for him, but I was also making my own choice clear. I would not be the one to step back. Not anymore. He was quiet for a long time. I could feel his gaze on me, searching, questioning. Finally, he said, okay. It was the same word he had whispered that morning, but this time it felt different. It was less a fragile promise and more a quiet decision. It was a step forward, taken together. That night, when we laid down in the nest of blankets, there was no chasm of awkward space between us. He turned to face me immediately, and I did the same. We lay there in the firelight, just looking at each other, the silence stretching on, full of a new, tentative peace. He reached out and brushed a stray piece of hair off my forehead, his touch feather-light and deliberate. It was a gesture of such simple, unadorned tenderness that it made my throat ache. I'm sorry, he whispered, and I knew he wasn't apologizing for the kiss anymore. He was apologizing for the fear, for the retreat, for the hurt he had caused me that morning. I know, I whispered back. And then I did the bravest thing I had ever done in my life. I closed the small distance between us and rested my forehead against his. His skin was warm. I could feel his breath on my lips. We stayed like that, not kissing, just breathing the same air, our eyes closed, anchored to each other in the vast, snowy silence. It was more intimate than any kiss. It was a silent vow to weather this together. Sometime during the night, I felt his arms wrap around me, pulling me securely against his chest, and I fell asleep to the slow, steady beat of his heart, feeling, for the first time in my life, completely and utterly safe. The next morning, we woke to a world of blinding, brilliant sunshine. The snow had finally stopped. The light streamed through the window, scattering diamonds across the floor, so bright it made us squint. Outside, the landscape was a masterpiece of pristine, untouched white, the pine trees heavy with their snowy burden, the sky a piercing, cloudless blue. The storm was over. The world was reborn. And in the quiet of the cabin, it felt like we had been, too. Julian was already awake, watching me, a small, hesitant smile on his face. It was the first genuine smile I had seen from him in days, and it was like watching the sun rise. "Morning," he said, his voice soft. "Morning," I replied, my own smile feeling just as new, just as fragile. There was no awkwardness, no regret. There was just a quiet sense of wonder, as if we had both woken up from the same long, complicated dream and found ourselves in a better reality. The spell of our isolation was broken a few hours later by the distant, grinding sound of a snowplow. The outside world was coming back for us. A year ago, that sound would have sent a pang of anticipatory grief through me, the signal of Julian's imminent departure. But today, it felt different. There was no panic, no sense of an ending. We stood at the window together, watching the big yellow machine slowly clear a path back to civilization, and I felt Julian's hand find mine, his fingers lacing through my own. It was a simple, solid gesture. A statement. He wasn't going anywhere, not really. He was here, with me, his hand in mine, and the cleared road wasn't an escape route. It was just a road. We spent the rest of the day in a state of gentle, domestic bliss. We made a huge brunch, talking and laughing, the conversation easy and light. We shoveled a path from the door to the woodpile, working together, our breath pluming in the cold, crisp air. Everything was ordinary, yet everything was new. Every shared glance, every casual touch, was imbued with the weight of everything we had been through. We were redefining the boundaries of our relationship in real time, not with words, but with small, quiet actions. We were building a new foundation, one based not on assumptions and unspoken rules, but on the terrifying, liberating truth. That evening, his last before he had to drive back, we sat on the sofa. The power was back on, the lamps casting a warm, steady glow, but we didn't turn on the television. We didn't need the distraction. He leaned his head on my shoulder, a comfortable, familiar weight. I leaned my head against his. We just sat there, listening to the crackle of the fire, content in the shared silence. It was a perfect bookend to the storm, a return to a familiar posture, but with an entirely new meaning. This wasn't an act of unconscious comfort-seeking. This was a choice. This was a statement of belonging. "So," he said after a long time, his voice a low rumble against my collarbone. "That checklist," I felt my body tense slightly. "Yeah, I think I'm going to throw it out," he said. He lifted his head to look at me, his eyes serious and clear. "It's a stupid list, and it's been making me miserable for a very long time." He reached up and cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. "I don't know what the new plan is, Leo. I have no idea what comes next. But I know I wanted to start here. With you, hope, so bright and fierce it was almost painful, bloomed in my chest." "Yeah," I whispered, my voice thick. "Yeah," he confirmed, his smile soft and certain. "Is that okay?" I didn't answer with words. I leaned in and kissed him, a kiss that was full of all the hope and relief and quiet joy that I couldn't articulate. It was a kiss that tasted like a new beginning, like sunshine after a long storm. It was the start of a new kind of quiet, one that we would build together day by day. We learned, in the weeks and months that followed, that a foundation built in the crucible of a snowstorm is a remarkably strong one. He didn't quit his job overnight, and I didn't suddenly become a different person. The changes were subtle, incremental. His business trips grew shorter, with longer weekends spent at the cabin. He started leaving things behind, A toothbrush, a favorite sweater, a stack of books, small, quiet claims on the space on me. The guest loft fell into disuse. My bed, which had always felt far too large for one person, was now just the right size. We were slowly, carefully, merging our two disparate orbits into a single, stable trajectory. There were still moments of fear, of course, moments of uncertainty, especially for him, as he navigated the uncharted territory of his own heart. But we learned to talk about it. I learned to ask, and he learned to answer. The silence between us was no longer a space to be filled with my anxious analysis, but a comfortable room we shared, a place of rest. I still took photos of him, but now he saw them. He would watch me work, a quiet smile on his face, and when I showed him the prints, he would trace his own likeness with his finger, as if seeing himself for the first time through my eyes, through the lens of my love. And in his gaze, I began to see myself differently, too. Not as the quiet observer on the sidelines of his life, but as the center of his stillness, his home. In the end, it wasn't the grand, dramatic confession that changed everything. It was the snow. It was the silence. It was the quiet courage to say, stay, and the profound grace to hear the word. Okay, we didn't fall in love during that weekend. We just finally admitted that we had been in love all along. The storm didn't create something new. It simply stripped away everything that was hiding the truth. It forced us to stop running, to be still, and to finally see each other. And we began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together.